We're delighted to have with us this evening one of the stars of talk in this country, Michael Smerconish. I'm not sure when talk really became a sort of career category, but the fact is that the sheer act of knowing how to manage talk well on either radio or TV or both can these days turn someone into a celebrity, and Michael certainly has made it. He didn't start out as a talker. He started as a lawyer and actually made a decent go of it for 10 years, specializing in complex tort litigation. But he was always also interested in politics, initially as a Republican, and even while still in college, he served as an advance man for George H.W. Bush, who was vice president then, and later he worked at HUD under Jack Kemp. Anyway, he got into radio, which became a full-time occupation for him a little more than a decade ago, and he's been on a roll since. He has his own show on Sirius, channel 124, and he's also now on CNN on Saturday mornings, and occasionally at other times. But lest you think Michael is all talk, he also writes. He's been doing a Sunday column in the Philadelphia Inquirer for a number of years, and he's also authored 5 previous books, all nonfiction. 2 of them were New York Times bestsellers. Muzzled, which is an entertaining and alarming book about political correctness, gone wild, and Murdered by Mumia, which was co-written with Maureen Faulkner and is about the murder of her husband, Philadelphia police officer Danny Faulkner. Michael lives in the Philadelphia area. His 6th and latest work, titled appropriately Talk, is his first novel. It's a political thriller involving, as you might have guessed, talk radio and politics. Conservative talk radio, though not liberal, and I guess that's because there really is nowhere near as much left-wing talk as right-wing. The book follows a rising star in conservative talk radio who's forced to balance his ambition with his conscience, and the radio host gets promoted to a Tampa radio station just as Florida becomes critical in a presidential election, and the host, who's a very influential voice, ends up holding a key to the election. And that's all I'm going to say about the book, except that it's entertaining and very gripping, and I'm halfway through it. And I wouldn't have put it down except that I had to come out here and introduce Michael. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Smerconish.
Thank you, Bradley. You'll be interested to know that Marina Ein, who is the publicist for Talk, is here tonight. It was not her responsibility to orchestrate where I would go to do events and signings and so forth, but rather to arrange interviews for the book. But she nevertheless saw the schedule of the rollout. And when she slid her finger down the column and came to, I'll say, a chain store that shall remain nameless in the Virginia suburbs, she said, "Why are you going there?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you should be going to Politics and Prose." And I said, "So I've heard." And then the night that I found myself at that nondescript chain store in the suburbs of Virginia, Haven Pell was there. And he came up and greeted me and he said, "Great to see you, but why are you here?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you should be at Politics and Prose." And I said, "So I've been told, can you help me?" And here I am. Thank you, Haven. Thank you, Marina. I appreciate the suggestion, and it's nice to be here. I have other friends who are here tonight. TC is the best producer in all of radio, and she accompanied me here tonight, and it's great to have her with me. It's great to have Dan Henning, who is also with TC. Monique Lyons is sort of the third wheel of our team of 4 in putting on the program on a day-to-day basis on Sirius XM. Catherine Caperton is also here from the POTUS channel, which is the channel where I'm heard on Sirius XM, and I feel comforted by having so many friends and some old friends who are here tonight as well. Barry, nice to see you. It's been far too long. You didn't have the ink when we were last together. Didn't we both? Yes. Didn't we both? So on the way here from Philadelphia tonight, I filed my Sunday column for the Inquirer. And I thought I'd give you a little insight into the column that I just filed because it directly relates to the subject matter of the. And Dan's parents are here. Madge, nice to see you. Mr. and Mrs. Henning, it's nice to see you both. So I filed a column in which I'm commenting on this Pew Research survey that was just published within the last 10 days and got a tremendous amount of attention from all of the major news outlets. And the headlines were similarly ominous in the way that they characterized what was the largest ever sample of American political attitudes by the Pew Research Center. The New York Times, by way of illustration, polarization is dividing American society, not just politics. The Washington Post, in putting a headline on this new Pew Research, said, "In polarized United States, we live as we vote." Politico, polarization highest in recent history. And at CNN.com, Bruce Stokes, who's the director of Global Economic Attitudes at Pew, offered his own summary of what the data shows. And he said this: "If you thought that political polarization in America was bad, think again, because it's worse than you thought. And if you're under the impression that dysfunctionality in Washington is merely a product of partisan political gamesmanship on Capitol Hill, try again, because a new survey finds that the divisions inside the Beltway actually reflect a deep ideological divide within the U.S. public that manifests itself not only in politics, but in everyday life." Well, I'm not buying any of those conclusions about the data that's just been put forth by Pew Research, because while others are seeing a confirmation of that which divides not only Washington, but Americans in each of their neighborhoods, I'm seeing something else. And make no mistake about it, in this largest ever sample of data from Pew, the undeniable bad news is that the number of partisans is on the rise. And specifically by that, I mean that those among us who have a consistently conservative outlook or a consistently liberal outlook have grown in the last 2 decades from 10% to 21%. But the better news is that 4/5 of our country is not in that grouping. And that's what I think gets lost in translation. And even Pew, in analyzing their own information, noted while ideological silos are now common on the left and right, these sentiments are not shared by all or even most Americans. The majority do not have uniformly conservative or liberal views. Most do not see either party as a threat to the nation, and more believe their representatives in government should meet halfway to resolve contentious disputes rather than hold out for more of what they want. In other words, Americans are centrists. The vast majority of Americans are centrists. They disbelieve the partisan hype that they're fed by one party about its opposition. And to them, compromise is not a dirty word. And I thought that was significant because it was also confirmation of many other things that I've read in the last few years in this heightened climate of gridlock and polarization. Just this past January, Gallup took a survey and determined that 42% of Americans are not R's and are not D's, but rather they are I's. They are independents. Similarly, a year ago, Esquire magazine put together the Romney polling team and the Obama polling team and gave them the assignment of trying to determine exactly how many among us are really in the center, and their number was 51%. You'd never know that if your only source of information were the cable television news outlets or, even worse, talk radio. And I think that this polarized media climate is directly responsible for the polarization and the gridlock that exists in Washington today. And that's what I set out to describe in writing this book. And I made a conscious decision, obviously, that I wanted to write it as a work of fiction. I could easily have written it as nonfiction. I began writing this as a work of nonfiction, and I thought, I don't know that I'm really going to attract interest in it. It would be very rote. It would have been very easy for me to put together a dozen or 15 chapters and make the case that the polarization in Washington today is largely tied to the political climate that we get in the media. But I thought it would be more interesting for me as the author, and I thought that it perhaps hopefully would be more interesting for the reader if I tried to make all of these arguments through the eyes of a fictitious talk radio host based in Tampa, Florida. And I'll come back to Stan Powers and talk about him in a moment. But let me back up and say that I have been paying attention now for 35 years. On a day-to-day basis, as Bradley mentioned, I'm spending 3 hours a day hosting my own radio program on Sirius XM. I'm hosting my own television program now on Saturday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern on CNN. By the way, just announced today, it'll now be re-aired at 6 p.m., which is great news for me because I can't expect folks on the West Coast to get up at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning and watch my show. And I write a weekly column for the Philadelphia Inquirer, which often gets picked up in newspapers across the country, and I enjoy writing books. I think those credentials, in addition to the fact that I cut my teeth working for George Herbert Walker Bush back in the 80s when he was initially vice president and then president, and having worked in politics on a local, state, and national level, give me the credentials to say I've never seen things as bad as they are today. I have never seen the gridlock that exists in Washington, and indeed in government across the country, the way in which it exists today. And so I ask myself, and I make it a running theme of the program, to say, how exactly did we get where we are today? Especially when, in the era in which I became involved in the early 80s, on Ronald Reagan's watch, the Senate was 60% comprised of moderates. You know, so many moderates existed in the Senate at that time on both sides of the aisle that among Republicans they had their own gathering organization. They called themselves the Wednesday Lunch Club. And you had Bob Packwood in that organization, and you had Bob Dole, and you had two from my home state of Pennsylvania, John Hines and Arlen Specter. You had Alan Simpson, and you had Nancy Kassebaum. If I stood here long enough, I could probably identify all of them for you. 60% of the Senate on Ronald Reagan's watch comprised of moderates. Today, none. Literally none left. And that's not me making a subjective statement. That's me reflecting on the National Journal's data, because every year the National Journal, nonpartisan, unaffiliated here in Washington, D.C., takes the ideological pulse of the House and the Senate. They identify 100 or so votes where you can easily discern a conservative and a liberal point of view, and then they tally the votes and they say, well, okay, what are we left with? And what they have found for the last several years now is that every Republican is more conservative than every Democrat. Every Democrat is more liberal than every Republican. And, you know, sometimes I have a hard time convincing people who think, well, isn't this the way that it has always been? And I always say, well, no, it hasn't always been this way. And simply go back 30 or so years in time and you'll see that it was much, much different. And then I say to myself, well, in those 3.5 decades that I've been paying close attention, what else changed? And what else changed in that time period, and I don't believe in coincidence in this case, is the media climate. I cut my teeth in the world of talk radio on an FM talk station in Philadelphia that was called WWDB, 96.5 FM, as we used to say, the talk station. I'm getting a nod of, do you remember WWDB? The hosts at WWDB when I came of age were this kind of odd assortment, odd in terms of having widespread political views. Frank Ford was an unabashed liberal, married to the then district attorney of the city of Philadelphia, and Frank was a mainstay on that station. Irv Homer was a libertarian before any of us had heard of Ron Paul, much less Rand Paul. We had a conservative. His name was Dominic Quinn, but Dominic was best known not necessarily for his politics or his ideology, but rather his command of the English language. And the person for whom I would most often guest host was the evening host. His name was Bernie Herman, 10 to 1, 10 p.m. until 1 a.m. And, you know, his moniker, we didn't call it a brand, but his shtick at the time is that he was the gentleman of broadcasting. And I often think back about Bernie Herman and filling in for Bernie, and I wonder if today an aspiring talk radio host were to go to a radio station and get the attention of a program director, and the program director were to say to that man or woman, well, you know, what's your program all about? Oh, I'm the gentleman of broadcasting. You're not getting on the air. That's just not the climate in which we live. And I watched it change. I had a front row seat because this was a major FM talk radio station, the only talk radio station in Philadelphia at the time. There was a 5,000 watt station that it really didn't command an audience. And this was the last major market, the last major station to accept Rush Limbaugh in the early 90s. And so I watched the whole genesis of what became at that station and radio stations across the country. Limbaugh had success as a syndicated talent in Sacramento. This was at the time of the first Gulf War under George Herbert Walker Bush's watch. And soon radio stations across the country wanted to have Limbaugh, and they wanted to have a stable of his imitators. And so the litmus test changed. The litmus test had been personality. Are you a conversationalist? Can you command the attention of people for a sustained time period? Oh no, that went out the window. And now it was a test of whether you had sufficient conservative bona fides to warrant your place on the radio dial. And it was immensely successful as a business model, and Fox News, coming online in, I think, 1996, decided to take a page out of the handbook of the talk radio world. MSNBC came out of the gate roughly at the same time, really couldn't find an identity for a while. It wasn't until in the second term of the Bush administration, meaning W, that MSNBC found its voice doing from the left what Fox was doing very successfully from the right. And so in the same time period that the talk radio and cable television news climate changed significantly, so did Washington. That's the exact same era in which we went from 60% moderates to none. And as I said, I don't believe in the coincidence of it. I think there was a causal connection, and I think too many individuals who are in this town are taking too many of their cues from men and women with microphones, and that it has largely been to the detriment of the country. Now, I don't think that it's only the fault of the media. I think that there are several contributing factors to the gridlock that exists today. I'd put at the top of the list, along with the role of the media, gerrymandering and hyperpartisan districts. And Nate Silver, when he was still at the New York Times at the 538 blog, had a lot of good data and a lot of good research on this. It was Nate Silver who said if you go back to 1992 and you look at 435 congressional districts in the country, 103 of them were truly competitive. Competitive defined as the presidential race is going to be decided within 5 percentage points. Today, the 2012 cycle, that number that had been 102 is down to 35. I spoke in California 3 weeks ago, and on this very same subject of polarization. The day that I was there, the LA Times had a story that said of all of the congressional districts in California, and they have more than 24, probably closer to 36, one was going to be truly competitive. And according to the Cook Political Report, there were only 7 competitive districts in the nation this year. So, this hyper-partisanship, what do we reward? Sometimes we stand from the sidelines and we say, well, my God, if 90% of the country wants to see some level of background check for firearm purchases, a la Toomey Mansion, then why in the world can't Congress get it together? And aren't they going to be held accountable if they go home not having been supportive of Toomey Mansion? And the answer is, well, no, they're not going to be held accountable because they're going home to very like-minded individuals, and there is no sense of accountability because they're only responding to that sliver of the electorate that they represent. So I get it. Hyperpartisan districts, gerrymandering are a big factor. Thus far, although it's a little bit early to write the conclusion, I'm encouraged by what I see in California with the top 2 system. California has now gone to a system where the top 2 finishers in a primary, regardless of their party affiliation, come back and square off in the general election. That's the kind of thing that I think is going to hopefully bring competition and new blood to Washington. Closed primaries are another factor. The idea that only Republicans get to vote for Republicans in a primary and only Democrats get to vote for Democrats. you take a look at what has gone on with the nomination of the Todd Akins or the Richard Murdochs or the Sharon Angles or the guy in California or in Alaska, Joe. Somebody help me. Joe Miller, right? Wasn't it Joe Miller? Am I right about that? You know what I'm talking about. Those individuals who can win the battle but lose the war. My favorite example is Christine O'Donnell. I mean, here's Mike Castle in Delaware, who had been a governor, who had been a member of Congress, runs for the U.S. Senate. Christine O'Donnell runs against him in a Republican primary, best known for what? Best known for having proclaimed her witchcraft in front of Bill Maher. And she wins. And how did she win? Because 12% of the electorate came out. The same percentage, by the way, that came out in Eric Cantor's defeat in Virginia just 2 weeks ago, and I recognize that Virginia is an open primary state, but those low interest elections bring out the partisans, the very passionate, and who are they? They are the ideologues among us. Another factor, if you were saying to me, what accounts for the gridlock in Washington today, and after I lay out my case for the media influence in this, I would talk about fundraising. Because I think that the money aspect has had disastrous consequences. You know, they are, these members of Congress, they're really only in this town Tuesday through Thursday and pretty much during a school calendar year. And the rest of that time, they're largely at home and they're raising money. I am a big believer in the idea that when people get together and break bread and have a cocktail, they become more civil toward one another in their day-to-day existence. But remove that socialization factor and it becomes far easier to demonize your opponent. And I think that the role of money and the lack of people establishing roots here in Washington when they're elected to the Congress is another contributing factor. There's a book out by Bill Bishop talking about the big sort. This would be another item on my list of what's driving the gridlock that exists today. The idea of the big sort is that whereas we used to be a society that belonged to the Elks, whereas we used to be a society that belonged to veterans of foreign wars, the local VFW, and would bowl in leagues, almost like that other book, Bowling Alone, something happened post-1960s where we kind of broke apart, and when we re-engaged, we engaged according to our very particular and identified interests. Think of it this way. Think about the people that I know you know who get all of their news from the triumvirate of Drudge, Fox, and talk radio. And think about others who rely exclusively on MSNBC and Huffington Post. Very emblematic of what Bishop describes as the big sort, where we're now associating in tribes of our own. And those interactions with people who are of a different mindset, I think, is another contributing factor. I could probably give you 5 more that I think have value, but I'll give you just one additional factor in terms of what drives polarization, and that would be social media. Robert Reich wrote a piece that caught my eye months ago. I'm not sure if it was the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, but it was on the subject of bile. And Reich, who had been Clinton's labor secretary, said that he'd been going through an airport recently and someone verbally accosted him and called him a commie pinko. Seems a little dated, by the way, doesn't it, to call somebody can't you come up with something better than a commie pinko? And he said that, it caused him to have an exchange with this individual and wanted to know, like, where are you getting this from? What would cause you to say such things? And Reich then launched into a conversation about what he thinks drives this kind of incivil communication. His theory, by the way, was income inequality, which is much more in his wheelhouse than it is in mine. But in making his argument, he talked about social media. And as someone who does what I do for a living, it's kind of incumbent upon me to have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. And it's kind of odd, by the way. People are much more hospitable toward me via Twitter than they are on my own Facebook page. But the point is, in both of those forums, people say things that no one has ever said to me, thank God, face to face. And this whole notion of anonymity in social media, I think, is another contributing factor to the incivility among us. I worry about, my wife and I have 4 kids, 3 of them are teenage sons. And I worry about them because I think they're growing up devoid of social interactions. You know, I'm of an era where if you wanted to ask someone on a date in high school, we had this new invention. It was a push button phone. And you would dial on that push button phone, you know, her house, and live in fear that her father would answer the phone. And you'd have to talk your way through him in order to get to her. And I've learned from my sons, that's just not the way it is anymore, Dad. You can just, you know, text message and see if things are going to happen. Well, I think in that process, we're losing the ability to deal with one another. And I look at some of the vicious nature of what goes on in social commentary. I mean, I'm a news junkie. Every day at 5 a.m., I'm perusing 24 newspapers. And as much as I try not to, I'm looking at comments that are appended to those main stories. And, you know, does it take me 2 comments or 3 comments, regardless of the subject, before it devolves into a debate about Obama, regardless of what the subject matter may be? I don't think that's healthy. So, to come back to why I'm here, I had all of this in my head. You know, this is my world. I mean, I have to compete in this environment. And I frankly had had enough about 2 years ago, because my mainstay is to deliver a 3-hour radio program Monday through Friday. And I was on 80 stations across the country, primarily 80 AM stations, where I was surrounded by individuals with a very doctrinaire point of view that I didn't share. And you would stumble upon me, perhaps, and I say stumble upon me because you would come to those outlets looking for conservative talk. And if now you stuck around long enough to hear my program, I would have appeared to you to be the commie pinko that somebody once called Robert Reich. And I thought, this is just not an environment that's conducive to the kind of conversation that I want to have. I was never one of the shouters. My politics have definitely evolved. I voted for, in the course of 30 years, in every presidential cycle, I was always voting for the GOP candidate, splitting my ticket elsewhere. And my break came in 2008. And I had a choice of saying this is what I was doing. I mean, there are curtains on ballot boxes, and I could have kept my mouth silent, but I kind of had taken the audience along for this whole ride of why I was about to do what I was doing. And after I publicly said, here's how I'm voting, I'm not telling you how you should vote, but I want to explain my rationale, that became a pretty inhospitable place for me. And coming to Sirius XM and the POTUS channel in particular was really the right environment. But I wanted to do more than just talk about these things. I wanted to put them in print. My column often in the Inquirer, like this Sunday, deals with polarization. And that's when I decided I'm going to write a book on this issue, and I'm going to go deep on the subject of how we have ceded too much of the ground for our discourse to the chattering class. And so I came up with a character. His name is Stan Powers, and I placed Stan Powers in Tampa because Tampa is in the heart of the I-4 corridor, much like the suburbs where I live in Philadelphia. You win the I-4 corridor, you win Florida. You win Florida, as we learned in 2000, chances are you're going to win the presidential race. So Stan Powers is a talk radio host in Tampa, Florida on WRGT. Think about that. And Stan Powers is kind of ill-suited for the position in which he finds himself, because he grew up a stoner and a slacker in Fort Myers, Florida, tending bar in a redneck joint on Route 41, where it was pointed out to him he has a knack for picking good songs. And by good songs, I don't mean songs that people like to listen to. I mean songs that people like to drink to. And so the man who owns Shooters, this very Confederate establishment, puts him in charge of the house sound when the live acts are not playing. And so successful is Stan Powers, at birth Stanislaw Pawlowski, I guess a tip of the hat to my own heritage, that he's given more and more latitude to dictate what the music will be among those who are coming to listen in the bar. And it's pointed out to him by a summer love interest that, you know, maybe there's a career in this for you. He becomes a disc jockey, has success, works his way up the radio ladder, finds himself doing afternoon drive in Pittsburgh, which is a medium market. He's making a decent living. And now the opportunity arises for him to go back to his home Florida and do what is the sort of a time slot morning drive. And in the process of his relocation to the state of his birth, the station where he's going to work is purchased by a religious conglomerate wanting to get into the talk radio industry. And so they say, well, you're under contract and we owe you the money, but why not try your hand as a talk radio host? To which he says, I know nothing about talk radio. I'm not a political person. I don't even follow the news of the day. What makes you think I could do it? Don't worry is the answer, because we've hired the guru to the stars. We've hired Phil Dean. Phil Dean is the talk radio whisperer. And so this picture emerges of Phil Dean, who was burned out himself from the radio industry, but he is the sort of the puppeteer who is guiding conservative talk radio hosts across the country, giving them their daily talking points. And the picture that I present is one of a very formulatic paint-by-numbers scheme where you frankly don't need a lot of skill. You just need to say these things and then repeat them, bang the president and keep moving, and people will respond. And Stan Powers finds it remarkably easy to become, because of where he's located, a kingmaker. Now, with a presidential race on the horizon, all of the GOP candidates are currying favor with him because they want his stamp of approval, because they want to win Florida. And so not only is that taking place, but the GOP convention is coming to town. And Stan is thrilled with the notion of his rising star, but increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that in order to attain his professional goals, he's going to have to betray his own moral code. And so the conflict that builds is one of, what's he going to do in the end? Is he going to be true to himself, or is he just going to take the money and run? And that's talk in a nutshell. I'm really proud of it. You know, I've been this route before, and in each instance, I found myself second guessing. I wish I had written this, and I wish I'd gone in a different direction. I'm so at peace with this book. It's intended to be a bawdy read. I hope you'll buy it. I hope you'll buy it at Politics Prose. Beware of the language, and I kind of serve notice in the very first sentence of the book. In terms, because I thought people are going to be, you know, they know me, if they know me as an author for Murdered by Mumia, and all of a sudden this is going to be a bit of a shock. So I better let them know up front, this is not what you may have been anticipating. That line, though, like much of I'm not, it's kind of funny, I'm comfortable writing it, I'm not comfortable saying it while I'm being videotaped. But if you look at that first line of the book, is something actually said to me by a radio consultant, as are many of the other instances that I write about in the book. I am not Stan Powers. I never on air said things that I didn't believe. I've said plenty of foolish things over the years, but at the time, I believed them all. What can I tell you? I'm not this guy. But I did try to weave together things that had happened to me along the way, and I'm hoping that readers, as they read the book, will be kind of scratching their head and saying, my God, is that the way it really works? And in large part, the answer, I hate to tell you, is yes. So it's meant as a wake-up call to entertain you, and also for you to say, why have we allowed this power to be vested in these hands? And maybe it's time to wake up, particularly among independent thinkers, and become more engaged in the process. So thanks so much for allowing me, Bradley, to lay it out, and I'll stop at this point and hope that there are comments or questions. Hey, the website said beer and wine. Beer and wine. I'm looking at natural spring water, but that's okay. I'm kidding. I need the icebreaker. It always comes, let's just cut to the chase and get to the icebreaker. Who's it going to be? Perfect. You're the icebreaker. Oh, yes, please. Come up to the microphone so that they can record your voice.
I should ask your forgiveness before I annoy you and others over here, but I'll try my best, to bring some light.
Please.
My name is Dharma, and I'm a Tibetan from India, and we have a radio station called Radio Free Asia. It's just like Voice of America, but we have the Tibetan language service there. And so I did get the good opportunity or the golden opportunity to work there and learn something. And actually I learned a lot. We have to do a lot of research. So I worked there for about 8-9 years, I think, whatever. I have nothing to do with them right now, but just so since unless it's programmed or whatever, it's so perfect, like it comes so fast and all that. And then you look very sincere. And therefore, in terms of people thinking about the other side of the phone and all that, they have all these crooks out there just to grab, either to dig your brain or just even to, let us flow in this manner or that manner. That kind of danger is there. Since you look very sincere and all that, do the radio or the broadcasting and the television also train us, to be how to grab those bad ones out and then let the real sincere ones, if they're trying to reach us.
You mean among the callers?
Yeah, among the callers. Because, otherwise you'll be wasting your whole life and they will spin you until you grow old. And we have, for example, for ours, we have free calls from China and my country, Tibet. It's up there in the mountains.
Sure.
So all that, they're supposed to be investing all that money. I bet they have other motives, but whatever. Still, it can do good if we really take the opportunity and make use of it, right? So do you guys get trained in all that kind of stuff? And then plus other, yeah.
I have been so liberated of the negativity. I can't tell you. There was a sea change in going from terrestrial AM radio to POTUS on Sirius XM. The demographic is different. I have said, so I may as well say it here while the camera rolls, that I think that the AM band of talk radio is facing the same existential threat as the Republican Party. It's just too white, too male, too old, and too angry. And I reached a point in my life, I could be practicing law, again, day to day, or doing any number of things. And I decided that this is not personally stimulating for me to engage in the kind of conversations that I was having in that forum. And just as I was having that kind of an awareness, SiriusXM came to me and said, we have this channel. We're going to give you a lot of opportunity to do that which you would like to do. And I hoped it was going to be a good fit. I really didn't know until I got there. And it's just been wonderful. So on a day-to-day basis, if you listen to my program, and now I see Monique is here, Monique Lyons, who answers the phones here in Washington, even though I am in Philadelphia broadcasting the program. But very rare, wouldn't you say, Monique? Very rare do we deal with nasty callers or very negative. And I when it happens, and maybe it's once every 2 or 3 months, I immediately let them know, whoa, you're mistaken. You're on satellite now. You think you're on AM. Go back to where you came from, because we're trying to have a conversation here. Is that fair? Oh, step on the microphone. I want you on the record on this. Poor Monique. She just taught tennis lessons after getting off the air. Now I've worked her into my.
All dolled up for you, Michael.
Speak to the level of discourse that we try to have on a day-to-day basis.
Well, we were talking about nasty callers. We don't get many, and every once in a while, someone will be really, really rude, and I try to contain myself. But thanks for calling.
But they're the exception.
Yeah, the exception for sure. Everybody wants to engage in your conversation and share their side of the story, or enlighten you. Quite often they're educating all of us on a particular topic. So I think that's what's so interesting, that not only do we learn, we get a number of sides, because we do get callers that say, Michael, you're missing the point.
And we put them on the air first.
Yeah.
First.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, and now they have figured it out. I mean, by the way, I have to talk to you because we need to rein this in. The way to get on the air is to say, Michael is missing something. And now that I've said, well, Monique is calling from Poughkeepsie and wants to tell me that I am missing something, now that I've verbalized that, I think they know, I see. If I want to get on the air, what I have to tell Monique, the call screener, is...
I haven't gotten into that too much, and so I think I'd catch on quickly.
Good.
But I think, right?
I mean, we like to hear differing opinions.
Mm-hmm.
A day like today, I'm here in Washington, so a day like today, I should tell you, we talked all about the trademark issues surrounding the Redskins.
Oh, yeah.
And all viewpoints were represented. How boring it is if it's monotonous and only people taking the same perspective. That's just not a brand of talk radio that I would like to be involved in.
Exactly.
Anyway, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.
Who's next?
So, Michael, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the whisperer figure that you have.
Yes.
The great whisperer, Phil Dean. Is there somebody like that out there?
Probably the most popular question I get asked from people who've read Talk, who is Phil Dean? Phil Dean is not one person. Phil Dean is a composite figure based on a number of consultants who over the years have given me the kind of advice that Phil Dean gives to Stan Powers. So there's not one individual. I'll give you a great example. At a certain point, Phil Dean, the consultant, who is in this Adobe shack in Taos, and the picture that I try to present is one of him with headphones and the ability to tap into talk radio stations all across the country so he can listen into how his clients are doing relative to the talking points he's given them. And at a certain point, Phil Dean says to Stan Powers, the protagonist in the book, Stan, you've got to hang up on at least 2 people per program. And Stan is kind of perplexed by this. Well, how am I going to know who to hang up on, and why am I necessarily going to hang up on people? And that was told to me. You know, there was a consultant hired by a radio station who said to me, "You're never going to cut it in this business because you are insufficiently nasty." I don't know what his word choice was. You got to hang up on more people. And I said, well, if they deserve it, I guess I will, but why would I just hang up on them for the sake of hanging up? That's just the way that it is. That's the way it works in this business. So those bits of advice, yes, they really have been given and are still being given in the industry. Yes, sir.
She was waiting.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Hi. So you made a really good point about social media and the way that it sort of spawns vitriol. As someone who came of age in the age of Facebook, I was wondering if you think there are any ways that it can actually spawn, positive discourse.
Well, I guess the positive discourse that can come from social media is where whistleblowers say things that they don't feel comfortable saying if they had to reveal themselves. You know, that to me is the single best argument for permitting anonymity in this kind of a conversation. I still don't buy it. I still believe in those newspapers that used to publish your letter to the editor and withhold your name so long as they knew who you were. But the sort of thing that I see on a day-to-day basis where people, and I'm sure we've all seen it, just, any kind of a news story becomes the launch pad for bombast. And I don't know what the redeeming value is of that sort of thing. I really don't. But what's the upside? The upside is we become aware from people who have information that they wouldn't share if they had to stand on the soapbox and let you see their face.
So obviously you just wrote a book about talk radio, conservative media, and how it's cookie cutter and all that. How would you say bringing passion to the middle to terrestrial radio? Because obviously SiriusXM is paid for. It doesn't have anywhere near the market share that these syndicated terrestrial talk radio hosts have.
Well, I think that terrestrial talk radio, unless it changes, much like the GOP, is on an identifiable timeline where it will come to an end. It's either going to change or it's going to die, because through attrition, that constituency just isn't going to be there. I guess by now it's been 4 years. It may have even been 5, but I was invited while I was still on terrestrial radio, while I was in national syndication. I was invited to go to the National Association of Broadcasters, the NAB, and deliver the keynote address. This was a confab in Chicago where all the owners and all the program directors come together under the same roof. So this was truly, going into the den of the decision makers. I was not as out in terms of my thinking and free with my expression as I am with you and as I am in this book, but I was getting there. And I made the pitch in front of these 500 radio professionals that we need to change the industry because it's in our best interest as broadcasters, but also it's in the country's best interest. This is not serving the country well that we are putting forth this brand of conversation. And it was kind of interesting to see how I'd be received. Pleasant, I guess, would be the response, respectful. But when the confab broke up and now it was cocktail hour, they were all anxious to come over and whisper in my ear and pat me on the back and give me the attaboy. You're so right. We need to change. The industry is headed down a disastrous path. We've played this for far too long. But they haven't changed. They just haven't changed at all. That business model is still the same. The closest that they've come is that, here's Mike Rogers, who is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, leaving that position to become a talk radio host. And one of the three big syndicators in the country is looking at him as a more reasonable voice among conservatives. So that's the sort of baby step that's been taken in the direction of trying to expand the focus. But I don't see it happening. It's not a big constituency that it services, but it's a passionate constituency. One last thing, and I'll stop. The ratings in radio today are the people meters, PPM meters. They're like a beeper system, if we even remember beepers, where you're wearing it electronically and it's tabulating what you're listening to. So there's nothing that's required of the person who's in the sample size. It didn't used to be that way. When I got started in the business, it was an old-fashioned Arbitron diary system, and you'd be paid $1 a week in a fresh $1 bill if you would agree to be an Arbitron family. And the way that typically those families would operate is that at the end of the week, they'd go back and they'd have a 7-day schedule, and then they'd try and remember what had they been listening to all week long. When I was not syndicated on a radio station in Philadelphia, in afternoon drive, I was getting better ratings than Limbaugh, Hannity, and I guess Beck was not yet on the station where I was located. And once a year, Arbitron would come in and make a presentation, and they would show us the diaries. And you'd get to see where people had filled out the diary, and also there was a free-flowing comment section. And what I remember is that I never made the comment section. People would never say anything about me in the comments. I would get credit for their listening. It was almost like a more passive form of listening, but I wasn't the sort that it's Smerconish, we need more of. But Limbaugh and Hannity, they would get that hell yes kind of a reaction from the crowd. It taught me a lot about passion to look at those diaries, and passion is what wins this race. And in the same way, then, it translates into who comes out to vote in a closed primary state, in a congressional race with a hyperpartisan or gerrymandered district. It's all related. And it's driving us, I think, off a cliff. I like your hat. Thanks for wearing that.
Thank you. Fellow Pennsylvania trial lawyer.
All right.
And I think you answered a lot of what's been going through my head. I mean, I've been studying this and talking to the trial lawyers about for the 40-year infrastructure that was built up since Lewis Powell's memorandum. You mentioned Wednesday noon meetings. There's the Wednesday talk group that Grover Norquist has, feeding his side of the story and things like that. Just a couple things that go through my mind, and one is I think when Reagan started and he made the statement that government is the problem. A lot of the people around him and a lot of people that were in government at that time knew he was kind of putting them on because they were working with government or trying to make government work for them. Now we have a whole generation that's grown up really believing that stuff. And I'm just wondering how long you think it might take to unwind all of the infrastructure that's been done, all of the political framing, which is the business you're in and a lot of other people are in when they want to get something talked about. I mean, you talk about headlines, you're framing a story, a trial lawyer, you're framing your issues, things like that. And it worries me because I have my teenage son here, like you have a teenage son, and I don't know if we can go another 40 years in this type of thing. And you mentioned passion. Getting the middle to be passionate is an awful hard thing.
Sure.
So I don't know if I'm just making comments or if there's anything you can comment on along those lines.
I'm on a one-person crusade to build awareness. I don't have the solution to all of this. The best that I can do with each of these platforms that I've been afforded, writing, radio on a day-to-day basis, because this is a constant theme now on CNN. I'm going to do a commentary on Saturday morning on CNN all about rebutting the Pew poll and saying, hey, this is not bad news. This is good news. The silver lining is that the power rests in the middle. Unfortunately, rests is the operative word. And if you're not happy with what's going on and you're not represented by these extremes, well, you've got to be engaged. I worry on a subject like, very vivid in my mind is the fact that today I had on radio Michael Crowley from Time, who wrote the current cover story about the Iraq situation. It was just published today. I highly recommend it. It to me, it was the most illuminating look at the big picture of what's going on in the Middle East, and it's certainly not just Iraq. And what it brought home for me, this conversation with someone very knowledgeable about what's going on over there, is how, we're caught up in these simplistic, it was Bush's fault because he took us in. No, it's Obama because he didn't stay long enough. And we're losing our place. It requires a much more sophisticated level of understanding that we're not getting from this kind of discourse. Maybe it's going to take something really catastrophic for us to appreciate, I hope not, that we've let it go too far. I would have hoped that with the congressional approval rating at 15%, it would be a wake-up call sufficient for people who are independent thinkers to get involved in all of this. That hasn't happened yet. So if I had more of an answer, I'd offer it to you. I wrote the book trying to take a different approach in making people cognizant of the fact. Final question, I think. Go ahead.
You just said that the power rests in the middle because they've got
the numbers.
Yeah, they've got the numbers on it. But if their choices are the wingnut on the right and the wingnut on the left, because they're the ones who elected them, how much power do they actually have?
Right. Well, we've got to do something about that. I mean, I mentioned California with the top 2 primary system, which I think is a step in the right direction. I think California has, it's funny, we chuckle at California initially when they come up with these ideas, and then 5 or 6 years later we say, you know what, they're a pretty good idea in California. Professional drawing of the congressional lines, it would be a step in the right direction. We do need campaign finance reform, which would be another step in the right direction. I thought there was going to be a third presidential offering in the last cycle. They really did. Americans Elect was successful in getting ballot position, I think, in 48 states. They couldn't find someone that they thought was suitable to be the candidate in that circumstance. There are ways to address it, but it begins with first coming to terms with the fact that it's out of control and those on the far right and the far left are not serving the best interests of anybody in the country. Thanks for coming out on a school night. It's awfully nice to be at Politics and Prose.